If you don't know me, my name is Stephen Ray. I'm here on the teaching team at Church of the Commons. Next week, we launch a series exploring the book of Matthew. And so in order to set us up for our time in the Gospel of Matthew, this morning, we will be overviewing the entire Old Testament story in 12-ish minutes. We're going to go from Genesis to Malachi all the way through the Old Testament story. And knowing the Old Testament story is going to be important for two reasons. Number one, our New Testament is really just a commentary on the Old Testament. Our entire New Testament is just trying to explain the Old Testament in a new way. And number two, as we look at this story, we're going to see that it's not just the story of the Scriptures, but it's going to be the story of our own lives. The entire Old Testament story can be summarized in one sentence. It's the story of a faithful God to unfaithful people. That's the entire Old Testament story. It's the entire story of all of our scriptures, of a faithful God to unfaithful people. We're going to see that God is going to go on mission in the Old Testament. He's going to try to reach a lost world with his love and compassion. And what he's going to do is he's going to invite a people group called Israel to be his people and to be his representatives in the world. And what we're going to see is that they will fail to do so. Instead, they will run after different gods and do all these different other things. And the story of the Old Testament is of God remaining faithful to his faithless people. And that is the story of your life. That God has remained faithful when we have been faithless. When we have run after other things, God continues to pursue us with his love. The story of God's faithfulness begins in creation. In the beginning, God creates a world where there is no sin or shame or brokenness or disease or death. He creates a world where what the Bible authors call it's a world filled with shalom. Shalom means perfect peace. And this perfect peace is perfect peace between God and mankind, mankind and neighbor, and mankind and the created order. It's a world of complete perfection. And in the middle of his perfect creation, there's a garden called Eden, where the first two people, Adam and Eve, lived together in the presence of God. And when God created Adam and Eve, he endowed them with something called the image of God. Adam and Eve are called to be God's representatives throughout the entire creation. And Adam and Eve are welcome to reign with God in his creation. And here's what's important about creation. Adam and Eve were the people of God, in the presence of God, in the place of God, carrying out his purposes. Adam and Eve were the people of God in the place of God, in his presence, carrying out his purposes. Every single one of you were created on purpose and with a purpose, to know God and walk with him. And in God's created world, God gives Adam and Eve one rule. There was a tree called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And God says, the day you eat from that tree, you are deciding what is right and wrong on your own terms, not mine. And God says, when you do that, you die. And so Adam and Eve, they're given this one rule, and they end up failing to be God's representatives. Disguised as a serpent, Satan comes and tricks Adam and Eve from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And when they do that, that transgression, that sin, causes sin and death to infect God's world. The whole world and humanity now experience a fall. Sin and death become the unnatural, natural state of things. And because of their sin, God removes Adam and Eve from his presence in the garden. But before they leave, God gives them a promise. And the promise is this, that one day a descendant of Eve will come, an offspring of Eve will ultimately crush the head of the serpent and bring God's people back into his presence again to experience shalom. While his people are cast out of the garden, God has a plan to bring them back into relationship and into his presence. And God begins to recruit different people to partner with him in evangelizing the world. The first part of his plan involves a man named Abraham. God comes to Abraham and he enters into an agreement with Abraham. He says, although you're childless, I'm going to promise you, Abraham, that you would have a family that would become a great nation. And that nation would inherit a land known as the land of Canaan. And through your family, all of the nations of the world would be blessed. Even though at the time of receiving this promise, Abraham was childless, he had faith. And because Abraham had faith, God credited it to him as righteousness. From this man Abraham, the nation of Israel, God's people, will come. Abraham is promised that one day, one of his offsprings would reveal to the world God's character and nature and promises. Hundreds of years later, Abraham's family grows and becomes a great nation. And at this time in the story, they're living in the land of Egypt. There in the land of Egypt, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, subjugates the nation of Israel into cruel and harsh slavery. For 400 years, the nation of Israel is enslaved in Egypt. Their slavery gets so bad that Pharaoh starts to kill off the firstborn of all of the young Israelite boys. The nation of Israel cries out to God to send a rescuer, and hearing their cries, God sends a person called Moses. And Moses went before the king and said, let God's people go. And if you refuse, then God will send plagues to come and attack the nation of Egypt. The Pharaoh refused to let Israel go. So 10 different plagues come up against the land of Egypt as judgment. And the final of the plagues is the most dangerous, but also the blessing to Israel, known as the Passover. On the night of the 10th plague, the Passover, the angel of death sent by God is sent throughout the land of Egypt to kill every firstborn of every household. But God provides a way to escape the judgment. Israel is to take an innocent, spotless lamb, kill it, pour out its blood, and take the blood of the lamb and put it over the doorposts of their households. When the angel of death sees the blood, it will pass over that household. That night of the Passover, Israel is freed from their slavery and sent out into the wilderness. When they get to the Red Sea, God parts the waters of the Red Sea, and Israel walks over onto dry land, and the waters close, and they could never go back to their land of slavery ever again. The Exodus event is the cross of the Old Testament. The Exodus event is the moment of God's salvation work on behalf of his people. And after he frees them from their slavery, he brings them out to a place called Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, God reveals to his people his law and his presence. God literally appears on top of the mountain as a fireball and thunder and lightning, and he speaks the law out loud to the entire nation of Israel. And at that moment, the entire nation is welcomed into an agreement. And God says this, you will be my treasured possession among the earth. You will be my representatives to the entire world. By how you live, your neighbors will discover who I am. And in this agreement, there are blessings and there are curses. If Israel follows the law that God gives them, the 10 Commandments, then Israel will receive blessings from God in the promised land. If they refuse to follow God's law, then they will receive curses. And the greatest curse is to be removed from the promised land and away from God's representatives. If you won't be God's representative, you don't keep the promised land. Once they enter the promised land, chaos reigns. Instead of walking in God's ways, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So God chose for them a king who would rule over them and establish peace in right worship of God. This man was a man named King David. David defeated Israel's enemies and established peace in the kingdom of Israel. And God came to him and gave him a promise. One day, an offspring would come from David who would establish an eternal kingdom where God's enemies would be completely defeated and peace, shalom, would be established once and for all. Once David died, no offspring came. All of David's sons proved to be failures. Instead of pointing the people to God, David's offspring introduced idolatry and injustice into the nation of Israel. It gets so bad that the nation of Israel enacts a civil war, and for hundreds of years, the people of God are at war with each other. They split into two nations, and chaos reigns again in the nation of Israel. For hundreds of years, the nations of Israel worshiped different gods and spread injustice in God's nation. They weren't being God's representatives like they had agreed to at Mount Sinai. God sent prophet after prophet, giving them this warning: turn back, repent to right worship of God, or be exiled to Babylon. But no matter what the prophet said, the people would not listen. Finally, in 586 BC, their prophecies came true. The nation of Babylon comes in and goes to war against the nation of Israel and utterly defeats them. The nation of Israel is defeated, Jerusalem is torn down to the ground, and the people of God are walked into exile hundreds of miles away from their home near the capital city of Babylon. There in exile, they're surrounded by a culture that mocks their ways and mocks their God and tries to influence them to conform to their own idolatrous ways of worship. But they were told by the prophets in exile, hold fast, for God will return us home to the promised land. All you have to do is wait. And in 539 BC, that promise comes true. The nation of Babylon was defeated, and the people of God are returned to their homeland in Jerusalem, and they rebuilt the city. But when they get home, not all is well. During this time, they are still ruled over by different nations like Persia and Greece and eventually Rome, and their neighbors are constantly attacking them. They don't have the peace and shalom that they had in the Garden of Eden or under the ruling leadership of King David. They're back in the promised land, but in many ways, it feels like they're still in exile. The Old Testament closes, and the people of God are wondering, when will God fulfill his promises? When will God deliver us from our oppression? When will this exile come to a close? When will God reunite the people of Israel and heal their brokenness? When will God send the offspring of David to establish an everlasting kingdom? When will the offspring of Abraham come to bless the nations? And when will the offspring of Eve come, who will crush the head of the serpent and establish shalom for all time again? For 400 years, there is no answer to these questions. As nations rise and fall and different potential messiahs turn out to be complete frauds, till the people of God are left with only skepticism and an ounce of hope left. Until, on a cold night in the first century, in a small, insignificant town, a baby boy was born who would fulfill all of the promises of God.